you. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today as we talk about some of the background and information about good clinical practice. So our objectives today with this module are describing the elements of a functional quality system. We're going to focus on information coming from a clinical investigator's site. We'll look at recent trends in noncompliance. We'll look at the role of standard operating procedures in GCP. Even though they are not a regulatory requirement for all of us, we are expected to have them in place, and we'll talk about that later. Characterize the differences between legal and procedural elements of GCP. So sometimes we see the regulation and how it's defined, we interpret it maybe a little bit differently. So we want to make sure that we're doing things uniformly and making sure that we're thinking about all of the aspects of the area that we are working in, whether it be informed consent or safety management and reporting or source documentation, and certainly investigational product accountability and integrity. We'll also talk about some of the high-level key differences between pharmaceutical, device, and biologics good clinical practice, some of the requirements that are a little bit different, such as safety reporting, investigational product, and the IND-IDE. So many of you are probably familiar with the common elements of GCP, as we call them. 21 CFR Part 11, and we have that in parentheses because we'll discuss in a moment. But 21 CFR Part 11 is electronic records and electronic signatures. So the FDA has provided guidance for us on computerized systems used in clinical trials. They've also provided guidance for electronic source documentation used in clinical trials. And this is in parentheses because many folks still don't really consider it when they're thinking about GCP, and we see that when we go out and audit where information is being transferred and stored on shared drives or transferred and stored on Excel spreadsheets. So we don't have control of that information. Also, the FDA has specifically stated that they most likely will not cite us to issues with Part 11 compliance when it comes to any findings that they have, and we have seen historically in the warning letters to Dr. Nemechek, for example, and others, that when there has been an issue with computer systems crashing and not having backup, disaster recovery, those sort of things, it comes down to the failure to maintain adequate and accurate records. So Part 11 is certainly a huge part of good clinical practices, certainly as we move more and more towards electronic record keeping, but it's not something that we always consider. And that's something to think about, that having that from a regulatory standpoint, that legal requirement, and then procedurally, how do we implement it? So 21 CFR Part 50, information about the protection of human research subjects through the document and process of consent. We also have received new information. The newest information that we've received from the FDA in terms of guidance has been focused on informed consent and electronic informed consent. So that is something to think about as well. We also saw a few years ago updates in 21 CFR Part 50 for assent, and so we've also seen feedback on or information about Part 50 in terms of those guardians, as well as changes in the last few years for requirements if we are conducting a trial, an applicable study that needs to be registered on clinicaltrials.gov. We need to have that information in our informed consent document. So looking at information, too, about financial disclosure, 21 CFR Part 54 requires us as sponsors to obtain financial disclosure information from all participating investigators, sub-investigators, and that information needs to reflect answers in terms of spouses and dependent children as well. This is different from what the Department of Health and Human Services, or OHRP, requires for federally funded research, such as NIH studies, where we talk about disclosure of conflicts of interest. We are specifically required to gather this information before we start the study because it is one quantifiable way for the FDA of assessing the potential for bias or conflict of interest in the research. It's certainly not the only conflict of interest that exists out there, but from a monetary standpoint, we have to disclose those SPOOs or those significant payments of other sorts, any stock, equity interest, honoraria, gifts of equipment, all of those things. And disclosure is one thing, but the next step, and which is often overlooked, we find, is the mitigation of any identified potential conflict. So you will be asked about how you assessed this information and what you did, what processes you put in place to mitigate any potential for bias in your research prospectively.